Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ryan Bijan, host of Cowtown Movie Classics, and welcome to this very special conversation on one of the great crime films, truly one of the great dramatic films made in the early 1930s, based on a true story. It's director Mervyn LeRoy's I Am a Fugitive from a Chain Gang. Joining us tonight is prolific film historian, author, and truly an expert on pre-code Hollywood films. Please give a warm round of applause for Mr. Stan Shaffer. How are you doing tonight, Stan?
I'm fine. And how about you, Ryan?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. You know, Warner Brothers 1932, this is the height of what would be known as the pre-code era in Hollywood. What was Warner Brothers house style in the 1930s?
Well, I'm a little loose in my definition of pre-code. The code itself came into effect in 1930. The studios decided that they could make more money by avoiding it. And so they made sure that they did movies that the public really had an interest in. And Warner Brothers was right at the top of that because Warner Brothers decided one of the best things for it to do was to rip things right out of the headlines. There's a current TV series, well, group of them called Law and Order, and they like to say, "Oh, they rip things." No, Warner Brothers did it first. Warner Brothers did Little Caesar was basically the story of Al Capone, and then there was also Public Enemy, and of course the movie we're about to see this evening, I Am a Fugitive from the Chain Gang. Mervyn LeRoy directed Little Caesar, and also he directed this one. And he knew exactly, he directed a wide range of movies. And at Warner Brothers, he was knocking them out. He did a really good pre-code that's a very fascinating movie to see called Three on a Match.
Yes, yeah.
It's a very short movie, but it moves so quickly. That's another thing about pre-code movies. There's no time to waste. You just got to keep moving. And this movie's a little longer than usual, but it still has that style, still has that pace, based on a true story.
What are some issues that are covered in this film that would have been unheard of just a few years later after the enforcement of the production code?
Well, number one, what you got to start with is what do you do about crime? Warner Brothers itself had a way of they approached their gangster movies and films as if sometimes a gangster was a hero, or as we could maybe begin to think of the anti-hero.
Mhm.
And so it was a matter where it was an evolution. The code itself was what's happening. Women, see, in the code, if a woman strayed or if she had sex before marriage, she must be punished. She cannot just exist having that sin upon her soul. And so that was a big thing. Gangsters, oh my God, a gangster, they're a threat to society. We're in the Prohibition era. They made a big business out of sin. And that became part of the creed of Warner Brothers. And Warner Brothers took advantage of it. And the nice black and white tone that in pre-code always works because there we are working. Well, what is black? What is white in real life? And that works in pre-code also. And also it was a matter where it was a lot of in the code, and Warner Brothers, of course, was at the front of this again, was about misogyny. In this movie, he gets involved with Glenda Farrell. Glenda has a little bit of a shady past. Yeah, actually, even before that, he when he escapes, one of his friends says, "Well, I'll make sure you have some entertainment tonight." And what does he do? He sends a woman to the streets. Now, we're not going to have that. Once the code comes in, Mr. Breen would have a stroke. And so Joseph Breen was the head of the Motion Picture Association at that point later on when the code was enforced. So Warner Brothers was at the top of it. Each of the studios did something about it. MGM was maybe a little sexier, but Warner Brothers was it was the real grit of the movement was at Warner Brothers.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
But a funny thing about this that I like to mention too, when we're talking about the Warner Brothers style. Now, all of the great heads of the studios always wanted some kind of prestige, and they would bring in people. And Paul Muni, even though he liked Edward G. Robinson, James Cagney, later on Humphrey Bogart would play these gangsters. Paul Muni came from the stage, and actually, when Warner saw him, he wanted him because he realized his background that he would become a prestige item too, succeeding George Arliss, who was the number one prestige star and a box office hit too at that time. So Muni was sliding into where Arliss was to this pre-code era.
Paul Muni's a lot of fun to watch, but I think by today's standards, if you look at a lot of the movies he did, like Juarez or uh, the story of Louis Pasteur, he was famous for
His
doing
Oscar winner.
these Academy Award winning biopics, like you said, prestige, big budget movies. Now, this may be a controversial take. At the same time, Paul Muni is one of those actors, you watch him today, he's very entertaining to watch. He has a lot of charisma, but a lot of those performances aren't as, let's say, naturalistic as you would say. And now you can chalk it up to that era. But to me, when I watch Edward G. Robinson or James Cagney, they're just as powerful and believable in a lot of their films today as they were in the early 1930s. Where Paul Muni, to me, a lot of his performances don't hold up in the same way. That said, I will say I Am a Fugitive from a Chain Gang. This is Paul Muni's most powerful naturalistic performance. He's very, very convincing, very believable in this movie.
I certainly agree. And I actually, what I believe is in the pre-code era, he is a little more natural. But then when he became more comfortable about being the star, at one point he was even billed as Mr. Paul Muni, he became more of an actor's actor. He felt he should take pride in that. When you see Scarface, okay, Scarface is an evolutionary movie for him. He had made a movie before called The Valiant. His first movie, he was nominated for an Academy Award right away. So that's what I mean about the whole prestige thing. His first movie, an Oscar. But as the time went by and past Scarface, and I agree with you that I Am a Fugitive is his most natural. He made a nice little light movie called Hi Nelly with Glenda Farrell, also kind of natural. But once he gets into these things where it's not just about acting. Sometimes you feel like he's doing a little pontificating,
Yeah.
especially in Juarez. So, you are right. Robinson and Cagney, their styles grew more natural
Hmm.
as they became more comfortable. Whereby Muni, I don't want to put them down, a great actor,
Of
one of our
course, yeah.
greatest actors, no doubt to that, and I know you agree. But he did enjoy being the actor's actor, and his wife was his coach at all times. So as soon as she became more comfortable, and she was like the power behind the throne, because when they came out, the talent scout found him in a play that George Abbott directed, and when he talked to him about it, he said, "Okay, we'll get you a deal because Muni wanted no long-term deal. We'll pay you $50,000 a movie." And he was like shocked. And Bella's listening. And he said, "But on Scarface, I only made 27,500." And Bella turned to him and said, "The money is fine. You deserve a raise." And
Oh,
so she closed the deal. As he would look to her all the time when he was acting. Others who have worked with him would say, Bella had the word. She was a former actress they actually met on stage.
as you mentioned earlier, it is based on a true story. Can we talk a little? We can talk more about this after the film, but how did Warner Brothers come across this novel, I Am a Fugitive from a Georgia Chain Gang?
Well, they always had people looking, like I said, for anything they could pull out of the headlines. And this was certainly right at the top of the list because Mr. Burns had escaped from a Georgia chain gang. A little bit of, when I think about this and I see a story, I think it's almost like a real life story based on Les Miserables.
Hmm. Yes. Oh,
Of
yeah.
course, he's never in a chain gang, but it's the same thing. He gets brought to prison for something he was sort of in real life. He was involved in the robbery. In our movie, it's a little different. But it was a huge penalty that beyond what he actually committed. And Mr. Burns actually escaped. Sheridan Gibney worked on the screenplay for weeks, and Zanuck brought Mr. Burns out. And when he brought Mr. Burns out, he was a fugitive. And so when they were shooting other movies and he heard any kind of gunfire, he started jumping. And Zanuck had even sent out a whole memo saying, "This is top secret. No one must know he's here."
Hmm.
So he did come out and he worked with Gibney on this screenplay for a while, but it was a bit too much for him and went back to New Jersey. Now, he did escape, and part of what we're going to see in the movie also reflects it before it actually happened, because later on he would be in New Jersey. They would capture him. He'd escape a second time. He went to New Jersey. 3 New Jersey governors refused to send him back to Georgia.
I was curious at the time. So Robert A. Burns, the author's, was that his real name, or did he use an alias when writing the book because of his
That was
situation?
his real name, because his name in the movie, when it comes out, the Zanuck sent out that memo. He said his name on the lot will be this name, which
Hmm.
is the name you'll see that he uses in the actual screenplay coming up. So as far as Zanuck was concerned, he will only be known by that name on the set and anywhere in Warner Bros. But of course, he made sure that not too many people we ran into him. And like I said, the pace is there, and and it has an amazing cast of character actors besides the wonderful Glenda Farrell at playing the woman who helps him out a bit and then turns on him. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of good stuff. And the thing to remember in mind, keep in your mind, is that this, unlike many other features that we'll see, they keep pretty much the book. Like I said, they did some things that happened later, but I mean, it was a good linear storyline. But he did keep a lot of stuff right to the book, and Gibney did a great job. There were others brought in, of course, as they always were at Warner Brothers, to work a little bit on it later. But it is true to the sense of what Mr. Burns' struggle was all about. And it did bring about changes in the Georgia laws.
Yeah, and we'll definitely talk about that more after the film. Mr. Stan Shaffer, thanks again. If you're in the audience, please stick around after the film so you can hear the rest of our conversation. Without further ado, from 1932, I Am a Fugitive from a Chain Gang. So, wow, to me, that ending still gets me to this day.
Oh my God, it is so beautiful. And it was done accidentally. There were trouble happening electricity wise, and so they shot it and they thought, okay, we're gonna have to shoot that again because trouble was happening. And they did shoot it again with better lighting. And when they shot it again, they looked at both, and LeRoy said, oh no, we got to stay with that first one. And at
Yeah.
one point, Zanuck had a little bit of trouble. In fact, years later, and you have these different autobiographies people come up with, and of course, it's their view of what happened. And Zanuck tried taking credit for it, but I really believe more Mervyn LeRoy's story is what happened. And it's like, oh, it's the perfect ending.
Hmm.
It's the perfect ending. And that could never pass the code.
Yeah. Well, it's actually interesting. Like, so Warner Brothers made so many wonderful movies in the early 1930s, a lot of these crime pictures, a lot of these melodramas. I mean, it really was a factory. They pumped out so many films at that time. But, a few of them, as you previously mentioned, have kind of made it into the history books, right? Films like Little Caesar, The Public Enemy, of course, I'm a Fugitive from a Chain Gang. A lot of like the truly great ones stand the test of time. But what was the public reception like at the time for this film?
The public perception, and that's a very good question because the public perception at that time was they hated the very idea of prohibition. So they couldn't really see these men who were making money out of something that they thought was a stupid law as real villains. Of course, they didn't condone the killing or the machine gun firing that was
Mhm.
happening everywhere. The same Valentine's Day massacre certainly took them by surprise. But that's why the anti-hero thing could work, because the public wasn't totally convinced they were all bad. And Warner Bros. Took advantage of that. And Edward G. Robinson was first, and Mervyn LeRoy's Little Caesar, which was a takeoff of Al Capone.
Mhm.
So, and Scarface too. Actually, Al Capone's nickname was Scarface, even though Scarface is not a Warner Brothers movie. It still is in the genre. And actually, as much as I love those Warner Brothers movies we've talked about, I consider Scarface back really the best of the gangster trilogy.
Oh
And of
yeah.
course, that predates I'm a Fugitive.
Hmm. No, I agree with Scarface. It's interesting because you can tell that Howard Hughes, Howard Hawks, they were watching closely what Warner Brothers did, and I'm pretty sure Howard Hughes had the idea like, okay, let's top it, let's make it bigger and better than anything Warner Brothers had done up to that point.
I certainly would agree. That's definitely the Hughes mindset. Let's
Yeah.
make it bigger and better.
Yeah, and he certainly did. But like, I Am a Fugitive from a Chain Gang, it's a fascinating film to me because it's hard to classify. It is a melodrama. It is
Yes.
it is a crime film. It's not necessarily a gangster film, but in a lot of
No.
ways, the idea of this average Joe, this regular guy, getting swept up into this world of imprisonment, crime, having to break the law to survive, it does foreshadow the film noir of the 1940s and 50s in a lot of ways.
Very interesting point, because what we're talking about, what brings about both things we're talking about, what is the plot of I'm a Fugitive, and now, of course, film noir, are war veterans. This man, who's our protagonist, is a World War I veteran. Society and circumstances forces him into a life of crime. And later in film noir, some of that happens. Of course, there's a beautiful female in the background that sometimes will bring them into whatever it is, but many times they're a veteran, and that becomes part of it, because even today we may have problems with how we really take care of our veterans
Hmm.
and the shock they come back from. And this poor man, Preston Foster plays this one he meets, and it seems like they click. But before Paul Muni knows, he and Preston Foster are robbing this man who he's already said, oh, we'll go down there, and this man's a nice guy to give us a burger or two. And Preston Foster turns the tables, and they're robbing him.
Hmm.
Poor Muni is just caught up in it, and so the spiral of our story begins.
Yeah. Well, speaking of Preston Foster, I'm glad you brought him up because our audience, if you guys are regulars to Cowtown Movie Classics, back in October, we showed the wonderful Dr. X, starring Preston Foster as the Moon Killer, right, with his synthetic flesh. And he's a lot of fun to watch in that. But another veteran of those Michael Curtiz Technicolor horror films is one of my personal favorite actresses of all time. From Mystery of the Wax Museum, we have Glenda Farrell.
Yeah, and she's always wonderful. She's the sassy blonde, which was a very important character during pre-code because they could get away with some lines that they could never even think about after 1934. And Glenda Farrell was one of the mistresses. Now, it's interesting you bring up both Glenda Farrell and Preston Foster. Very fine actors, but they became like the second string of Warner Brothers. They never got to that high part where Muni did, or Davis, or Stanwyck, but they were always dependable. They went from one movie after another. Joan Blondell is sort of like in between. And because of the sassiness and that great rapport, Glenda Farrell and Joan Blondell made 8 movies together. But basically, they're gold diggers. And a
Yeah.
lot of those are first in the pre-code era because they're out to get a man and get some money, not necessarily in that order. And Glenda Farrell, later on, she played this like investigative reporter detective called Torchy Blaine in 7 movies. That was hugely popular at one of us, and she could pull it off. She was just she had a very nice, smooth style that the audience was always in her pocket, but she never had the charisma to become the major star she deserved to be. Same thing with Preston Foster. Preston Foster actually beat out. There was a major movie called The Last Mile, which was made independently. And on stage, Spencer Tracy and Clark Gable did it. But when the movie was made, Preston Foster got the role.
Oh.
Some of that could have been budget. The other two were just rising, so they weren't that expensive yet, and studios. But it's just, I feel it's so fascinating because he was such a good actor that he could actually take that role they did on stage.
Mhm.
Fine people, both Preston Foster and Glenn Farrell, they deserved more and a lot of stage work, like they also did.
Yeah. Well, a lot of these films, especially I'm a Fugitive from a Chain Gang, it's filled with a lot of very recognizable character actors that you would see in a lot of these Warner Brothers films of the era.
Oh yes, absolutely. Edward Ellis, who was a really fine actor, he plays Muni's friend in prison. Actually, he winds up seeing him again when he gets sent back again. And Edward Ellis, not William Powell, was the Thin Man. People get that all mixed in
That's
because
right.
of the
Yes.
Thin Man the series, and you think William Powell. No, the Thin Man was Edward Ellis, who is a friend of William Powell's, and of course meets not a happy ending, but he was the Thin Man. A fine actor. Actually, he was so good and respected in the business that when they remade an old Lionel Barrymore movie, A Man to Remember is the title they came up with, they put Edward Ellis in a Lionel Barrymore role, and there couldn't be more of a compliment than for
Mhm.
someone to be able to recreate something Barrymore did first. We also have Charles Middleton in the movie. He was Ming the Merciless in the Flash Gordon movies. I'm sure everybody remembers him. He's just pops up every. Actually, he did a really good, maybe edge noir horror movie called The Strangler of the Swamp in
Sure.
1945, towards the end of his career. Fascinating movie and very neglected, very neglected. But you could always count, even when Middleton was playing a semi good role, there was always a sneer to him that you knew you can't believe him, you can't trust him. He's trouble. He's trouble. So yeah, and Alan Jenkins, who became a sidekick to many other great Warner Brothers people, wasn't it? And then, besides Glenda Farrell, the other leading lady who he falls in love with, Paul Muni, is a lady named Helen Vincent, fine actress. She didn't even make the second rung that I was talking about. And one of the reasons why that was because she was 5'8" or 9" tall.
Oh
At
wow.
Warner Brothers, that was a bit of a problem
Yeah.
because all of our lead actors were shorter than her. and, and so it did work in her favor. Even Daryl Zanuck, the head of the studio, was only 5'6". So none of the leading men, Cagney, Robinson, Muni, Bogart, none of them hit the 6 foot mark.
Yeah. Well,
So
yeah.
that hurt Helen, and she's really good because she plays the role of the woman he actually falls in love with, and she keeps faith in him, and that's what helps make that scene work well because she is a good actress. And well, what will you do? And it makes it work because we know that she wants to help him no matter what. The joke too, and we're bringing up Daryl Zanuck again, is Daryl Zanuck always said, and this of course was also with Mervyn LeRoy and Paul Muni, that they weren't allowed to step a foot in Georgia again after this movie was made. Georgia was out to get them. If they could, they would put them on a chain gang.
Oh, I can imagine. So how did okay, like that's what I'd like to talk about now is the social reform that this movie sparked when it was released. The national outrage against this excuse me, the chain gang system.
Well, as Georgia was tried to make him believe, of course, it wasn't nowhere near as they say, and of course, whenever you get accused of something that is such a threat, well, we could even use the sin. People decide to say, okay, now what can we say? What was good about it? And this is what they were trying to say: these men deserve this stuff, and this reforms them because they suffer all this punishment that they don't want to ever suffer it again. But laws went through. Actually, they went with Mr. Burns. He did escape twice, like we have in the movie. And then later, they actually did make a deal with him to come back. And he came back. They didn't send him back. But what they did do, they wouldn't give him a pardon. He wanted a pardon. They said they'll expunge it from his record and
Hmm.
he would be allowed to vote again. But they would not pardon him.
Oh
So
wow.
Georgia stayed with it, but it did make progress. Chain gangs were finished after this movie, after that book, and after what the public. Well, like I said earlier, three governors in New Jersey refused to send him back to Georgia. Not just one, three successive governors. And like Valjean and Les Mis, he became a model citizen. So he was doing so much good than the little, what we might call bad he did before.
Hmm. Well, I'm certainly glad that he was able to use his own personal tragedy and his own suffering to make a difference and to make a mark on this corrupt system.
Yes. Yeah, it was good that so much good came out of it. And some of these movies, some of those things did. These gangster movies actually were showing, like we said, about how the public had a different kind of indifference to what those gangsters were about. And eventually, when FDR came in, prohibition was repealed. It was
Mhm.
knocked out because the people felt it caused more trouble than it was worth.
Yeah. Well, as we close out our commentary on I Am a Fugitive, what are some other great Warner Brothers crime films of that era that maybe people haven't heard of or seen that you would recommend? If they like this film, what should they watch next?
Well, there's one interesting one I always think about too called Smart Money. And it's
I
the only
love,
time
yeah,
Energy Robinson and Jimmy Cagney were ever together. And
yeah.
that's one to watch and enjoy. Now, Cagney, one of Cagney's greatest scenes was pushing the grapefruit in May Clark's face. Poor May Clark didn't even get credit for being in the movie. She got the grapefruit, and that became like, even at the AFI tribute to Cagney, she stood up in the audience to talk about the grapefruit in the face. Former
Yeah.
leading lady of Frankenstein, but the grapefruit in the face stayed with everybody. And so Cagney and Robinson did these sort of things. Cagney did a movie called Little Giant, where he was a gangster who wanted to be more respectable. He always had, I mean, not Cagney, I meant Robinson, but Robinson always had that edge where he wanted to be better in the field. Cagney's character was, well, if you had to beat up a woman here and there, you got to beat up a woman here and there.
Yeah.
That was also part of the code. That's how it worked. Um, and Robinson. It's interesting to talk about Robinson while we're talking so about Muni to wrap up here. Robinson wanted to be Muni in many ways, and later on, when Muni left the studio, went to a lesser studio, Columbia, Robinson came more to the forefront of Warner Bros. And he started doing the biographical movies like Dr. Ehrlich's Magic Bullet or Dispatch from Reuters. Those could have very easily been Paul Muni movies earlier, but Robinson felt he had the class that he could be also there. But in the public's eye, he was still Little Caesar.
Yeah, and you know what? That's sort of the tragedy of it because I'm a huge Edward G. Robinson fan,
Uh,
and he had a similar background to Paul Muni. He was an Eastern European Jewish immigrant. He cut his teeth in the Yiddish theater. But even though he had
yes, both of them.
yeah, even though he had the stage training, you watch those Eddie G. Robinson films, to me he's incredibly naturalistic, charismatic, and believable. I mean, he may not, I mean, whether you think Paul Muni is an incredibly handsome man or not, maybe Edward G. Robinson didn't quite have the conventional looks, but I think going back and looking at his filmography, I think he's a much stronger actor than Paul Muni was.
I agree with you. I agree with you. And that look, we like to call ourselves so sophisticated now in the 21st century. But during that pre-code era, among the top stars of all time, at the top of the box office was Edward G. Robinson, Marie Dressler, Wallace Beery, George Arliss. My God, not faces you write home to mom about.
Yeah, but all incredible talents altogether.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Very much so.
Do you have
And
any
Muni
clue?
and Robinson at the top of the list.
Oh yeah,
Now,
absolutely.
Robinson, of course, we all know he went on to make, well, he decided he would finally not take top billing and make a movie that turned out to be one of his greatest, and that was Double Indemnity.
Hmm. Well, yeah,
and that changed things for him.
I'm glad you bring that up because he kind of had, I don't know if it was a career resurgence, but in the 1940s, he became just as identified with these noir films like The Woman in the Window, Scarlet Street, Double Indemnity, All My Sons, a lot of great stuff in the 1940s, just as much as he was identified with those gangster movies in the early 30s.
Yeah, so once when he left Warner Brothers, finally he got that prestige he wanted when Muni left Warner Brothers. He got to make a couple of those biographical movies. But then in the early 40s, he left Warner Brothers and it opened more opportunity. And when he actually did the role in Double Indemnity, it also impressed him enough that he was able to do other stuff, like the work he did for Fritz Lang, and later on, later work that he did in other movies of that era, like The Night Has a Thousand Eyes.
Mhm.
Um, he was one of our most brilliant actors. And he was never even nominated for an Academy Award.
Mhm.
Not we have a lot of great ones who would say, oh, they never won. No, he, like Mervyn LeRoy and Maureen O'Hara, were never even nominated for an Academy Award.
Which is certainly a disappointment because I would say Edward to me there's two actors that come to mind immediately, although there are many more in the business. But I always think Edward G. Robinson and Peter Cushing. They're the two actors. It doesn't matter if you're watching a B movie, if they're slumming it or doing. They're never better than the material. Every performance they give, it's as if they are not trying to get the Oscar, but to me they give it their all in any film. It doesn't matter what the genre is or what the budget was.
Absolutely. Nothing was ever beneath them. And
Hmm.
they made sure they took the challenge of the role and shared it with their audience. That was brilliant acting. Because a lot of acting is reacting too. So they were reacting the material given to them.
Yeah,
Brilliant. I
absolutely.
love they brought up Cushing because Cushing is one of my all-time favorites
Oh,
too.
oh yeah, absolutely. Well, do you have any closing thoughts on I Am a Fugitive from a Chain Gang?
Make sure make sure you see it again, because one of those movies that when you see it again, you're going to find more things. It has a wealth, not only like we said, of all these great character people in it, besides Muni and Farrell, but it has a lot of stuff that it actually can work even today.
Hmm.
It's brilliant. And Mervyn LeRoy is one of our most underrated directors because he could do all kinds of genres. I love John Ford. I love Howard Hawks. I love Todd Browning, but they did have certain auteur sensibility. And Andrew Saris, who's our major American critic of the auteur theory, he didn't give Leroy enough credit for everything he could do because of that.
Oh, well, actually, before we close out, you just reminded me. So Mervyn LeRoy, not only did he direct these hard-hitting melodramas in the 1930s, he's probably best known for being the producer of The Wizard of Oz.
Yes, yes, yes. Well, when he left for Warner Brothers, he was married to Harry Warner's daughter. So then he left Warner Brothers, and yes, he produced the Wizard of Oz, and a lot of the important choices casting wise were Mervyn LeRoy because we had an assembly of directors coming in and out there between that and Gone with the Wind, with Victor Fleming, King Vidor, they all worked on it at some point, but Mervyn LeRoy was really the unifying force. And you bring that up, but one of my favorite movies he did then as a director there was Waterloo Bridge. He made after he produced
Yes.
Wizard of Oz.
Yeah.
Brilliant movie.
Stan Schaefer, once again, thank you so much for your time. We always love hearing from you.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Thank you for inviting me. I love discussing old movies. So thank you again.
Well, you're in the right place. If you're in the audience, I hope you enjoyed the film. We'll be back next Monday at 7:30 p.m. with one of the truly greatest noir films, suspense films, thrillers ever made, director Charles Lawton's Night of the Hunter. Once again, my name is Ryan Bijan. We'll see you next week.